All right, folks, welcome back. This is lecture number 18 of our class, and we are back live today. So if you're watching this as a recording, we are meeting live today. So I hope you are able to attend our live class. To start off with, I just want to highlight the fact that there is a third reading response commentary that's due this weekend, this Sunday on March 27th. So in class, I'm actually going to poll the students to see if extension would be desirable. So make sure if you're not in class live today that you look out for an announcement from me about whether there will be an extension on this assignment or not. Regardless, I wanted to spend a little bit of our class this morning talking about the prompt for the third commentary and giving you guys a little bit of a chance to brainstorm some ideas to help you kick off this writing process. So the third commentary is probably the most open-ended of all the commentaries that you'll have to do in this class. And it's really asking you to discuss how people conform or challenge gender ideals. So in our first couple of lectures, we talked about the concept of gender. We used this case study of drag queens and hijras in India to talk about how gender roles are kind of stereotyped but also bended and challenged by these different sorts of identities. So that would be a case study that you could use to talk about how gender ideals have been conformed to or challenged. But there's lots of other things that you could do here. Really, the goal of this is to get you to think critically about gender. So as long as your commentary is focused on gender, whether it be kind of political, performative, if you want to talk about clothes, if you want to talk about sports, whatever you want to do here, the key is that gender is at the center. So two things that you kind of want to think about in constructing your commentary. First, what specific aspects of gender do you want to talk about? You can't do it all, so you want to really have a tailored kind of clear focus for what aspect of gender you're going to talk about. And then you want to provide two, maybe three examples that speak to how gender is either conformed or challenged. Now you can talk about both being conformed to and challenged in terms of gender. But you definitely want to make sure that you have a clear kind of narrow focus in terms of what aspect of gender you're going to look at. So if you're live in class, we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so to free write, brainstorm, and discuss with your peers ideas that you have for this third commentary. So if you're watching this on Zoom, go ahead and you can either take this time to do that, or you can just skip ahead to our content for today. So what are we talking about today? Today we are looking at one aspect of gender as it relates specifically to gendered forms of violence against Indigenous women. This is kind of encapsulated in what has become a kind of key phrase about gendered violence in North America: missing and murdered Indigenous women. So this is the reason why I wanted to include this class is because myself and Jennifer Byram, your TA, have started a research project that looks at the MMIW, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Crisis, through the lens of Twitter engagement. And so this is kind of an interesting opportunity for me to share some of our work with you guys so you can get a little bit of insight into what exactly it is that I do when I'm not teaching you guys. So as way of some background, in general, the issue of MMIW has been minimally studied by scholars and has only recently received kind of national attention by US and Canadian governments in the past 5 years or so. This is despite the fact that for Native American and Alaska Native peoples, homicide is the third leading cause of death among women between the ages of 10 and 24. It's also the fifth leading cause of death among Indigenous women between the ages of 25 and 34. Indigenous women who live on reservations in the US and Canada are murdered at a rate of more than 10 times the national average. Over 80% of Indigenous people have experienced some form of violence in their lifetimes. And people of Indigenous ancestry are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crime and rape than any other race in the United States. The National Crime Information Center in the United States has reported roughly 5,712 cases of MMIW as of 2016. However, in the U.S. Department of Justice database for missing persons, only 116 of these cases are actually identified. So I'm kind of curious to hear from you guys. What reasons can you think of for why we see a lack of kind of quality data between these different reporting mechanisms in the United States around Indigenous people? Some of these reporting issues can be linked to poor record keeping protocols. Others are associated with what's called racial misclassification, which basically refers to incorrect coding of individuals' race or ethnicity. For example, Native peoples are incorrectly coded as white, or they're misclassified. Yeah, they are often misclassified as being white. And this misclassification generally favors the predominant race. So while natives are often misclassified as white, it's rarely the case that white women who are flagged as homicide cases are misclassified as native. Another core issue here in terms of reporting is the fact that there's a poor relationship between law enforcement and American Indian and Native Alaskan communities, which often leads to law enforcement either ignoring MMIW cases or not reporting them as homicides or all sorts of reasons. Also surrounding jurisdictional issues with homicide cases or domestic violence cases that happen on reservation lands, which are under the jurisdiction of tribal police, and those that happen off tribal lands, which then are under the jurisdiction of state and federal police. So, reporting issues are also caused by the poor relationship between the media and Indigenous communities. This relationship is informed by institutional racism in the media. Institutional racism refers to the process of purposefully discriminating against certain groups of people through the use of biased laws or practices. Often, institutional racism is subtle and manifests itself in seemingly innocuous ways, but its effects are anything but subtle. So, Native women in Canada face a really similar crisis to those in the United States. Current reports indicate that, I should say, this data is based on the official report processed by the Canadian government as part of their government initiative to investigate the MMIW crisis. And this report was published in 2017. And what they found in doing this report was that Indigenous women in Canada are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other race in the nation. This report also showed that between 1980 and 2012, over 1,000 Native women were murdered in Canada. And as of 2018, 164 new MMIW cases had been reported in the country. In 2016, the Canadian government ordered a national inquiry into the MMIW crisis in response to this growing public outcry around this disproportionate experience of violence among Indigenous people. The final report from this investigation was published in 2019, and contains testimonies from more than 2,300 family members and survivors of violence. These testimonies spoke about the kind of surrounding context of MMIW violence, which is marked by multi-generational and intergenerational trauma, and issues around structural forms of violence like poverty, insecure housing or homelessness, barriers to education, employment, and healthcare, which make Indigenous women more vulnerable to different types of violence than other groups. The Canadian report presented 231 calls to action that were directed towards the Canadian government, social service providers, and Canadian citizens more broadly. At the heart of this kind of crisis that we see in the United States and Canada is settler colonialism. So, settler colonialism refers to a particular type of colonialism which characterizes our nation here in the United States, where settlers from outside of the territory come in and conquer the land and are here to stay. This is really different than other types of colonialism and imperialism, in which the goal is actually to colonize an area for resource extraction and economic gain rather than settlement. So, settler colonialism here in North America has subjugated Indigenous women as part of the colonization of this continent. And in doing so, the colonization has disrupted the traditional structure of Indigenous societies, which were often organized matrilineally and which had more kind of social safety nets that protected Indigenous women from violence. Now, this is not to say, right, that violence didn't exist prior to colonization. It definitely did. But the social structure in Indigenous societies had a kind of strict security blanket that actually allowed for the direct retribution and social management of people who enacted violence against Indigenous women. And so there was this kind of protective system that helped to limit violence as far as we know prior to colonization. So the denigration of Indigenous women has become an important step in kind of imposing settler colonial notions of patriarchy and private property. Economic marginalization has been produced by the theft of Indigenous lands, which places Indigenous women into these kind of precarious scenarios like homelessness and sex work, where they're more likely to experience violence. As part of the settler colonial state, the police have also overly criminalized Indigenous women while underprotecting and underreporting cases of violence. In 2018, the Urban Indian Health Institute conducted a comprehensive study to investigate the issue of MMIW in 71 urban cities across 29 states in the United States. These cities were selected because they had a significant population of urban Indigenous people. The UIH study is currently one of the only studies that is specifically focused on MMIW violence in the United States. This report basically looked at all case data from 1900 to the present in terms of what was currently reported in these 29 states' databases. But the oldest case that they really identified specifically around MMIW happened in 1943. So the majority of cases in this data set were identified between 2010 and 2018, which suggests that the actual number of MMIW cases is actually much, much higher, but formal reporting mechanisms prior to the mid-20th century kind of precluded formal documentation of these issues as such. UIHI found that there was 506 unique MMIW cases in these urban spaces. 8% of all of these cases were associated with domestic violence, 6% was sexual assault and rape, and 4% of these cases were identified as sex workers or victims of sex trafficking. Sadly, the youngest victim identified in this 506 caseload was only 1 year old, while the oldest victim was 83. 27% of these cases were victims age 18 or under. So you can see that the data is actually skewed heavily towards targeting particularly young Indigenous women. In terms of their kind of findings with regards to the distribution of MMIW, what they found is that the highest numbers of cases were in New Mexico, Washington, Arizona, where we live here, Alabama, and then others like Montana, California, Nebraska, Utah, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. So I'm curious again to hear from the class. What factors can you think of for why these particular areas, places like Arizona, Washington, etc., have kind of large numbers of deaths associated with MMIW? So take a couple moments if you're in class now to talk to your peers about some of the reasons you can think of for why we see these particular trends here in the United States. So for the rest of class, I want to kind of dive into the study that Jennifer and I kind of did, which is based on and inspired by one of the key findings of the UIH study. So one of the things that the UIH study did, in addition to documenting MMIW trends in MMIW cases, was to do a content analysis of media coverage of MMIWG in the areas that were identified for the study. So they looked at over 900 articles covering 129 different MMIW cases. The top 10 cases that received the most coverage made up 62% of all coverage about MMIW. And 47% of the media coverage actually just focused on one really high profile case, which shows that the media coverage is not being representative of the scale of the crisis, but instead focusing on these single, usually kind of particularly tragic cases of MMIW. What the UAH study found in their analysis of media was that the vast majority of coverage on MMIW was centered on reservation-based violence rather than on issues around cities, which is what the core of their study was. Much of this news coverage also used violent language, so language that engages in kind of racial stereotyping around Indigenous people. The UIH study showed that the media is not willing to commit to sustained coverage of MMIW issues. And when instances of violence are covered, Native women are often portrayed as deviant, highlighting their involvement in prostitution or as drug addicts. Both Native and Black women are typically portrayed as hypersexual beings who are doing the wrong kind of work in the wrong type of place. This blaming the victim approach places Indigenous women in a kind of lower echelon of the moral order. This type of kind of placing of Indigenous victims outside of morality is what scholar Debbie Harris calls strategic silences. So these are conditions influencing their lives or their movement from reserves to urban neighborhoods that are scarcely recounted in a manner that is reflective of the ways in which settler colonial nations like Canada are colonizing people. So rather than contextualizing the violence against Indigenous women, news media tends to make Indigenous women these kind of highly visible deviants who are unwanted, unmissed, and therefore disposable. So let's take a couple minutes to break from this kind of heavy stuff, and I want to have you discuss in small groups how how should and can our society address violence against Indigenous women? And what challenges do you see in addressing this particular crisis? So Jennifer and I's study has really been in, inspired by and situated within a kind of broader digital activism around MMIW. And digital activism has become one of the main ways in which activists, grassroots activists, have tried to bring awareness and gain responsiveness from governments to address the MMIW crisis. So the hashtag MMIW began in 2012 after Sheila North Wilson created the hashtag campaign to raise awareness about gendered violence in Canada in particular. But since 2012, a growing number of hashtags have been used to sustain this social justice movement. For instance, in 2014, Holly Jarrett started the hashtag #MINext campaign on Twitter in order to elevate popular consciousness around the violence experienced by Indigenous women after the disappearance of her cousin, Loretta Saunders. This campaign and others related to it have worked to circulate the movement ideas around MMIW and to mobilize these kind of weak ties among users to create change in the real world offline. Last year, me and Jennifer undertook a study about this kind of hashtag activism, along with another graduate student, Daniel Dolan Sanchez. So this study was a response to a series of federal and state laws oriented around documenting gendered violence in Native communities here in the US. The most notable of these kind of laws was US Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland's creation of a task force unit to investigate MMIW cases in 2021. So what we wanted to understand in our study was if and how Twitter users were engaging with these kind of legislative policy issues around MMIW. In other words, we were looking to see if there was a fit between what was happening online and offline around MMIW. So in order to understand this relationship between hashtag activism and public policy, we looked at historical tweets from 10 dates between November 15th, 2018 and October 12th, 2020. The specific months that we looked at for these tweets was based on the introduction and passage of major federal legislation in the US related to MMIW. So we used what's called a premium developer account, which is specifically for research, and it's the only way that you can actually get tweets that are more than 30 days old on Twitter. And then we use a targeted search using hashtags like MMIWG, No More Stolen Sisters, Not Invisible, to get a random sample of tweets. So in total, we had a data set of 9,800 and some tweets, and we removed all of the retweets from this sample, leaving us with about 1,600, just over 1,600 unique tweets from this time period. So to get a general understanding of what users in our Twitter sample were actually talking about and who was doing the talking, we decided to code each of the individual users based on the demographic information that they had offered. So we assigned them to different categories based on kind of how they designated themselves, specifically elite. Elites were anybody who actually had control over influencing policy, like senators or congresswomen or men. And then non-elites, which basically includes anybody who couldn't directly influence policy, as well as things like news sources, academics, specifically Indigenous organizations, as well as legal professionals. So approximately 4% of users in our samples were elite, which indicates that, at least based on our random sample of tweets, there's not a lot of public politicians actually using Twitter to talk specifically about MMIW or to use Twitter to raise public awareness around MMIW. the vast majority were non-elites, like you and I, which shows that this kind of the activism is actually much more dispersed and grassroots rather than public policy oriented. 10% of our users were female compared to 3% male. The vast majority of people didn't identify a gender, so we don't know. We can't say conclusively about these kind of trends, but it does suggest that there's a discrepancy here in who's engaging with MMIW activism if we compare it to the an assessment of all Twitter users, which is roughly 300 million. So, based on statistics from the total usership of Twitter, about 63% of Twitter users are male versus 36% female. So, as of 2020, most Twitter users are men, whereas in our sample, most Twitter users who identified with a gender were women. This suggests that there's something particular about how users identify as women with this desire for activism around gender violence that particularly targets women. The other kind of trend that we saw in our users was that 78% of our users didn't actually want to identify with ethnicity or race, but of those who did identify with an ethnicity or race, about 16% self-reported as being Indigenous. So again, we can't say anything conclusive because of the large number of people who don't report, but the fact that we have 16% of Twitter users in our sample identifying as Indigenous compared to the representative distribution of people who identify as Indigenous in the total population, which is about 2%, then we can clearly see that, again, people who are using hashtags, MMIW hashtags on Twitter have particular articulations between their own identities and the issues that are being discussed. So we had 1,653 unique tweets in our data set, and they roughly followed a bell-shaped kind of distribution with a clear peak in the total number of tweets collected in June of 2019. This trend offers initial evidence for a gradual increase in Twitter activity around MMIW issues from November 2018, when the Savannas Act was first introduced into Congress. So there's a kind of increasing public discourse around MMIW over time. The smallest sample of tweets that we have actually is associated with November 2018 and September 2020 collection dates. And these collection dates actually correspond with the introduction and passage of the Savannas Act. So this offers some interesting and somewhat confusing data, right? Because it's showing that the lowest points in Twitter engagement are actually the most pivotal points when legislative laws associated with MMIW are being passed. So this really suggests that the activism that's happening on Twitter is pretty divorced from what's happening in the public policy realm. The 7 kind of most prominent references that people used to talk about, I'll say the top 3 were politics, historical facts about settler colonialism, and the reasons behind MMIW, and then calls to action around holding governments and policing accountable for the documentation and prosecution of MMIW cases. Tweets that discussed politicians and political institutions made up a particularly large proportion of our sample, and were primarily associated with kind of sharing personal opinions and providing information. So these are really documentary efforts. Opinion-based tweets in particular often expressed a lot of frustration and anger around the unethical treatment of Indigenous people and problematic policing. A large number of users in our sample also expressed positive opinions, though, particularly around the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the government's effort in Canada to produce a systematic investigation of MMIW. So, if we think about why we started this study in the first place and we look at legislation, we see that tweets referencing laws or legislation comprise only 5% of all the tweets posted during the dates that we sampled. While the percentage of these kind of tweets that reference legislation is overall pretty small, there was a notable increase in tweets discussing laws, particularly in November 2019 and September 2020. In these months, references to laws make up 17 and 18% of posts that we sampled for those months. So this increase in legislative references likely corresponds with the release of Attorney General William Barr's national strategy addressing MMIW on November 22nd in 2019. It also likely corresponds to the passage of the Savannas Act by the House of Representatives in September of 2020. So the majority of tweets referencing legislation in 2019 and 2020 were coded as information dispersion, which suggests that when users referenced bills directly, it was primarily to publicize them rather than to engage in discussion about the merits of the bills, their impacts, or to mobilize more direct action. So using a targeted Google search, we quantified the number of news articles related to MMIWG that were published at the same time that we were looking at Twitter. And we wanted to do this to get a sense of, was Twitter mirroring the types of coverage and the frequency of coverage that we saw in traditional media? And so we looked at a couple of major news sources, things like Reuters, the BBC, NPR, the CBC, which is a Canadian broadcast company, as well as popular magazines like the New York Times, the Guardian, and the National Post. So really similar to our tweet sample, we saw that the number of news articles associated with MMIW issues was pretty low in November and December of 2018, and then has a huge spike in coverage during June of 2019. Across all the months that we sampled, CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, had the largest and most kind of consistent coverage of the MMIW crisis, indicating that Indigenous issues are a much more prominent facet of the Canadian traditional news cycle than they are here in the US. This more sustained political focus on Indigenous issues in Canada is mirrored in the demography of our Twitter user sample. So we had 47% of users in our sample reported as living in Canada compared to 25% living in the US. So the fact that we see increased coverage and across the board higher coverage by the CBC is mirrored in the fact that most Twitter users in our sample, or almost half of our Twitter users, were Canadian. So all of this like Canadian activism really speaks to a kind of disjuncture in terms of US and Canadian engagements with these critical issues for Indigenous people. And we should also say that this the representation of Canadian users in our sample is actually does not mirror the broader trend for Twitter. So Twitter has 330 million global users, like I said. And if you look at the distribution of those users as of 2020, there's 68 million Twitter users across the world, and 330 million of those users are from the United States. In contrast, there's only 6.8 million users who identify as being from Canada. So you can see in the total user sample for Twitter that the United States has a much bigger proportion of users overall than Canada does. But in our sample, Canadian users make up at least almost half. Another trend I want to talk about here is kind of distributions in what people were talking about over time. So in June 2019, we see large numbers of news articles on MMIW and large numbers of MMIW tweets. During this month, 65 online articles related to MMIW were posted, the majority of which were published by CBC. Compared to other months in our sample, June 2019 had a significantly larger proportion of tweets referencing politics, as well as a larger number of tweets intended to either share an opinion or disperse information. This spike in the total number of political tweets and their orientation around opinion sharing coincides with several governmental efforts, including the release of the final MMIW report by the Canadian government on June 3rd of 2019. So what we see is that this spike in June 2019 may have been galvanized by offline efforts around the documentation of MMIW, specifically in Canada. There's also a kind of distinct increase in the number of MMIW tweets associated with October 2020. So the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day on October 11th, a national holiday, is probably the primary driver of this increase in hashtag activism around MMIW. During this month, there was a relative increase in the number of tweets associated with opinion sharing, and particularly referencing historical facts about Indigenous peoples' history in the United States and Canada. This all suggests that users in our sample were likely inspired by the Indigenous peoples' holiday to engage with Indigenous issues more broadly, of which MMIW is one. So in contrast to our Twitter sample, there's a notable absence of MMIW news coverage linked to October 2020. Now, this lack of coverage points to the role of Twitter as a kind of digital counterpublic. So this is an idea that was coined by Mark Lamont Hills, and it refers to this idea that Twitter and other forms of social media are digitally kind of network communities where members kind of actively resist hegemonic power, they contest majoritarian narratives, and they engage in these kind of critical dialogues and expressions of their identities. So this idea really builds on the notion that marginalized groups find Twitter as an important space that is outside of mainstream discourse and mainstream stereotyping, where they can express opinions about issues that particularly impact them. So Twitter's function as a digital counterpublic is supported by the use of Twitter to mobilize direct action around MMIW issues through all sorts of calls to action posts. So these mobilization tweets are used to disperse information about MMIWG marches, vigils, and other events, as well as to discuss policy-based actions. So compared to other months, call to action tweets intended to mobilize participation in MMIWG make up a much larger percentage of the total tweets gathered in May of 2019. This activism is likely related to the passage of a Senate resolution on May 5th in 2019 that declared this day a national day of awareness for missing and murdered Native women and girls. So I'm curious to hear from you guys again. What other examples might you be able to think of that demonstrate social media's role as a digital counterpublic? Okay, and wrapping things up, So the last thing that we did in our study was to use an affect analysis to look at uh, what types of words and emotions were being expressed by tweeters in our sample. So over half of the kind of words that people used were pretty neutral, but this is important because it suggests that users have largely adopted a kind of similar discourse around MMIWG that is oriented around sharing descriptive information about the crisis rather than expressing kind of personal sentiments. So we can see that a lot of the engagement in our sample with MMIWG issues is about documentation, kind of neutral documentation rather than highly polarized opinion sharing. We also see negative emotions, particularly things like fear and sadness, making up about 34% of the words in our tweet samples. Um, while positive emotions only make up about 10%. The largest number of kind of negative affect words were associated with tweets linked to June 2019, that month where we had a huge peak in the number of um, engagements with Twitter. And this was the month that coincides with the introduction of the Not Invisible Act. So the kind of high number of words related to fear and sadness during these kind of key moments of legislative introduction is super interesting, and we think that this might be linked to the fact that Twitter users in our sample tended to engage with the traumatic legacy of violence uh, addressed by these bills rather than highlighting the positive impact of these bills. So, some key takeaways here. The small number of elites, academics, or official Indigenous organizations represented in our Twitter sample suggests that this particular social media platform is likely not seen as a platform for building expertise or legitimizing a movement's mission. Instead, the gender and ethnic identities self reported by users are dominated by these kind of non elite females, many of whom are Indigenous, suggesting that Twitter is primarily being used by hashtag activists to create a kind of culture internally, to create a kind of internal culture. We also see a preponderance of opinions and fact sharing posts in our tweet sample, which suggests that this discourse around MMIW is largely oriented around raising awareness about the crisis, as well as settler colonial history. Finally, we see that Twitter is being galvanized as a counter network that largely exists independent of mainstream media and policy work. So the attendance question for today is the Pantheon is green. Make sure to go into D2L and fill out the quiz for today. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.